Majesty, the Sorcerer and the Saint. Chapter 3. The Chase. The horse was a good ways off, nearly 50 yards. With one step, then another, Katy started forward slowly and found herself tiptoeing through the grass as though she were sneaking up on a mouse. Just then the horse raised his head and looked right at her. Katy stopped and giggled, then crept forward again. If only she could get close enough. One touch was all she wanted, one gentle stroke of his white mane. If only the horse would let her, and then he bolted. With a few long strides he had doubled the distance. Katy yelled, "Snowball, wait!" Amazingly, the animal paused and turned to look back. The horse seemed to know its name. Katy laughed at the thought, but her laughter turned to surprise when the beautiful white horse reared back on its hind legs, then turned and galloped away. "Wait!" she cried again and watched the horse disappear in the row of trees at the edge of the clearing. Katy ran across the pasture without a care of what lay beyond the woods and ducked inside the forest as she chased after the white horse. She scurried around trees and hopped over tufts of tall grass, following the horse as it weaved its way through the woods up ahead. It was all she could do to keep sight of the beautiful animal. Even though she knew it was impossible to catch him, chasing after the horse was so much fun. Katy giggled as she ran and knew she had to be dreaming. She felt lighter than air and ran till her hair flowed like silk and her slippers flit across the blades of grass and barely seemed to touch the ground. On and on she went through the maze of trees, laughing and running, but no matter how fast she went, the white horse remained at a distance. When Katy finally paused to catch her breath, she looked back and saw there was no path or trail, only the thick woods all around her, and everything looked the same. Strangely, the white horse had stopped to look as well. Katy smiled at him. Surely the horse knew the way back to the big green pasture. There was no need to worry. All she had to do was keep him in sight. Suddenly the animal bolted again and was off in a flurry of leaves and a cloud of dust. "Wait!" Katy cried, and ran on with the horse just ahead, never getting any closer and never getting any further away. The white stallion ducked in and out of autumn trees that were suddenly filled with leaves of amber and scarlet. Katy kept running and hardly noticed the trees changing colors. Above her, grey clouds rolled across the sky like a dark curtain drawn over the land, and as the light grew dimmer, the horse became strangely bright until he glistened like a jewel in the woods. Soon the forest was dark and the tall trees were hunched over and stooped with age. They reached down with twisted branches, and when Katy looked, the lush green forest was filled with shadows. The old trees with their knotted limbs began to melt away in the darkness until there were barely any trees left at all. When the horse finally stopped, Katy looked around once more, and the smile left her face, for everything was turned to night and she was hopelessly lost. How could this be? Where had all the trees gone? She wondered, then turned to see the animal watching her and nodding its head up and down. It seemed to be beckoning her to follow, and for the first time Katy got the impression that the horse had not merely been running, but was actually leading her somewhere. She also sensed that in some strange way, whatever he was leading her to was somehow responsible for all of this. The white horse turned and walked on, leading the way more slowly. "Wait! Please wait! Where are you taking me?" Katy's voice echoed into the night as she followed in earnest, looking around fearfully. The animal walked aimlessly across the hard and rocky ground that trailed off into the night. Katy followed, trying to avoid the sharper stones beneath her feet. She spent most of her time looking down as she made her way forward, glancing up every now and then to make sure the horse was still there. She limped and stumbled in her fluffy little slippers and did her best to keep up. Then when she was sure she could go no further, Katy looked, and to her surprise the horse had stopped. She stood there panting and afraid. Was the horse lost? Perhaps it had come to its senses and was too afraid to venture any further. Yes, Katy thought to herself, that was it. Now it will turn around and go back to that beautiful green pasture. Waiting there in the cold grey darkness, Katy could only hope. She looked at the horse, and the horse looked back at her as though it had suddenly reached its destination, which appeared to be in the middle of nowhere. Katy just stared at the animal and wished she had never followed the white horse.
"I'm so stupid,"
Katy heard herself say, then paused when she realized it wasn't her voice. Indeed, she hadn't uttered a word, yet she could have sworn she heard something. It was a little squeaky voice that barely sounded human.
"All alone, are we?"
There it was again. Katy hesitated, then looked behind her. She saw no one and felt silly for even looking.
"All the stupid ones usually are. Alone, that is. Till you showed up,"
said the voice. Katy looked again, and again she saw no one. She looked all around her, and finally glanced down at her feet. There she found a fat little chipmunk sitting on the rocky ground next to her left bunny slipper. Katy jumped back when the chipmunk sat up, gave her a disapproving look, and folded its tiny arms across its chest.
"He tricked you too, eh?"
Katy didn't know what to think. "Are you talking to me?" she asked.
"I'd turn around if I were you. Coravandia is no place for the likes of you, nor me for that matter,"
said the chipmunk. "I beg your pardon," said Katy, not sure how she should properly address a chipmunk, especially a chipmunk that talked. The little creature looked off into the night with a thoughtful gaze.
"Joylessness, joylessness,"
he said, sounding very tired. Katy decided to stop talking and just let the tiny creature have its say.
"Joylessness is to blame. Joylessness came to our land and all was darkened. He is responsible for all this, you know. He is a curse to this place."
Katy tried not to look confused, but she couldn't help it. "He?" she said. "Who?" The chipmunk looked at her as though she were crazy.
He who? Joylessness, joylessness. Haven't you been listening?"
he said. Katy drew back a little. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. You talk as though joylessness was a person." The tiny chipmunk looked at Katy and laughed.
"A person? Child? You have to have a heart to be a person. He is more monster than anything else. Gelzuin is his name, and he is joylessness himself."
The chipmunk turned around and started to walk away.
"The throne's changed hands. It's all gone bad,"
he said, then called over his shoulder.
"Don't say I didn't warn you."
Katy just watched him and marveled as the little chipmunk padded off into the dark. But before he got too far, he stopped and stood up on his hind legs, then raised his arm and shook his tiny chipmunk fist in the direction of the white horse.
"Rogad, you're an evil, wicked sod,"
the chipmunk yelled out in his squeaky little voice, to which the horse snorted and shook its head defiantly. The chipmunk looked back at Katy.
"Beware the great brown bear. He is out of sorts now that he has lost the throne."
Then, with a courteous nod, the chipmunk started off again and disappeared into the darkness. Katy watched him go, then looked at the white horse, which she regarded with greater suspicion and doubt. In spite of the warning, she took a chance and stepped forward. The horse didn't move. She took another step, then another, and still the horse appeared unconcerned as she drew nearer. Katy wanted nothing more than to climb aboard the back of the animal and ride him out of the strange land. Again, it was the thought that kept her going. Soon Katy was closer than she had ever been, only 10 yards away when she stopped again. She hadn't seen the huge rusted axe, with its blade buried in the ground next to the animal. The tip of the enormous axe was firmly embedded in the rock, and held the weapon with its handle pointed straight up in the air. She looked from the battered blade to the smooth ground beneath her feet. There were large grey stones, carefully set into place all around her. There were even strange designs etched into their smooth surfaces. Katy started toward the horse once more. How odd, she thought, that these fine stones with their peculiar designs should be in the middle of nowhere with those great stone pillars. At least the jagged rocks were gone and she could walk again. Katy stopped and looked around in shock. Great stone pillars? Her eyes bulged wide. There were 12 enormous stone pillars, 6 on either side of her. Where had they come from? She wondered. They weren't there a minute ago, or were they? Maybe I just didn't see them. Impossible, she thought. Whatever the case, they were there now. Katy shook her head, feeling like she was going a little crazy, and kept her eyes wide open in case anything else should suddenly appear. and just then something did. There was a terrible and loud creaking sound, the ear-splitting noise of ancient iron hinges pleading to be oiled. Katy expected that such a terrible noise would surely frighten the white horse, but strangely enough, the animal didn't even flinch and just stared at her with cold, dark eyes as an invisible door swung open in the empty space behind it. A bright orange torchlight covered Katy and lit the ground around her. It glared forth, and she shaded her eyes so she could see through the open doorway to the great stone entrance that lay beyond. Other things started to appear as reality shifted all around her, and the white horse began to change shape before her very eyes. The animal became darker, its smooth skin began to wrinkle and sprout warts, it reared back on its hind legs, which grew shorter and thicker, then hunched over like some terrible beast. Its neck shrunk down to a fat stump, and its forelegs became huge, hairy arms. Scraps of cloth, bits of armor and animal hide, wrapped with leather straps, were suddenly draped over the creature's body, and before Katy could even think, the transformation was complete. The horrible ogre, Rogad, reached down and drew his axe out of the stone which made the blade ring. He held the weapon in his massive fist and grinned. The creature was so big and ugly, it didn't matter that he was missing half of his teeth. Katy would have screamed if it weren't for the tremendous structure that was still appearing all around her. It loomed out of the darkness as though it had been there all along, hidden from view by some impossible source of magic. The dark castle walls stretched out on either side of her, while the castle towers seemed to go up and disappeared into the darkness. To the left and right of the great castle doors stood two giants, 40 feet tall. Their hulking forms held perfectly still and peered down at the child, with dark, brooding faces that were chipped and cracked with age. The moss-covered statues were cold and lifeless, and Katy was thankful of that. When the veil of magic was lifted, Katy staggered back, her mind reeling in disbelief. The space around her was now a huge open courtyard, surrounded by fortress walls, while high above, dark creatures milled about and looked down from their sentry posts. Katy stared, wide-eyed, trying to take it all in, then jumped when the ogre moved aside. Something was coming. Light surrounded the figure that appeared in the doorway of the castle, and Katy instantly knew that this was him, the one who was responsible for all of this. The man stood straight and tall and looked down with eyes as dark as the grave. He was draped in a long bronze robe, a lavish and regal garment that swept the ground when he walked. The material was thick and flecked with red sparkles that shimmered like polished copper in the dim torchlight. His fur-lined collar covered his shoulders like a lion's mane and made him look grand and powerful. He came forward to get a better look at Katy, who stood there trembling. She watched him glance toward the sky, and when his steely gaze came to rest upon her once again, his lips curled into a devilish grin, and he spoke slowly. "How nice. How absolutely splendid. The mouse has followed the cheese. Welcome, Katy Campbell." "I am Gelzuin," he said with a voice that almost purred. Katy stood rooted to the spot. He knew her name, and as if that weren't bad enough, she knew his name as well. When she realized where she had heard it, Katy jumped back and covered her mouth, startled. She hadn't recognized it when the chipmunk had said it, but now she was sure of it. It was the same name Jack had mentioned, the name on the sheet of paper, Gelzuin's sorcery and house of something or other. She remembered thinking that the name was silly when she first heard it, and figured that whoever had made it up could have spent a little more time thinking of a better one. She had no idea that the name was real and had a real person attached to it. But as the chipmunk had warned her, this was not a person. The thing standing before her wasn't even human. One look, and Katy knew that this was a wizard. He looked more like a wizard than anything possibly could. Perhaps it was his narrow eyebrows that were arched beyond belief, or the way he stood, poised for the moment, or his bedeviled smile. Katy couldn't tell what it was exactly, but knew he looked incredibly sly. Everything about him, even his sparkling teeth, looked sly, if not a little too pointy. He was tall, with hair as black as oil. Katy would have guessed he was in his 40s, but in human years he was closer to 500, and 40. Gold and lead beads braided into his hair showed that he was a wizard of great acclaim and a master above many. Katy tried to catch her breath as she gazed at the wizard. From the looks of everything, Jack was right. Wizards were indeed real. Katy glanced over at the terrible ogre that was still glaring at her. It appeared that ogres were real as well, and now that she had seen it all, Katy wanted to run. But since her feet wouldn't move, she used what little courage she had to remain standing and tried not to shake. "The travelling spell," she heard herself say, and was surprised that she could even make her mouth work under such horrible conditions. "Yes," smiled the wizard. "The spell is mine," he said, and turned away, with his robe billowing behind him, then shouted an order that made Katy jump. "Bring her," he said. The horrible ogre came forward. It took huge steps, and its head lolled from side to side. The creature looked clumsy, with its long arms banging against its knees. Katy watched him come closer and closer, until he towered over her, and his shadow covered her like an inescapable wave. Before Katy could move, the beast tossed his axe from one hand to the other, then reached out and grabbed her by the arm. The ogre's thick leathery fingers squeezed Katy's arm tightly and held her like a vice. She pulled, kicked and struggled to break free, but only managed to flop around like a helpless doll as the big, ugly monster brought her along and dragged her inside the castle. Chapter 4. Before Gelzuwin's Throne. Katy had no idea where the beast was taking her. All she could think about was the ogre's monstrous hand wrapped around her tiny wrist. The creature's skin felt like sandpaper that scratched her and made her wince as she staggered and stumbled along behind him. "Please," Katy cried, "let me go." Rogad ignored the child and never looked back as he grunted and snorted and brought her through the stony corridors of the castle, past flaming torches and towering pillars. Soon they came upon another beastly ogre, standing guard at the entrance of a large chamber. This was Slag. His lower jaw jutted out with huge yellow teeth that curled up on either side of his nose. Katy stared at the thick, ugly beast that growled and watched her with great suspicion as she stumbled past and entered the dark hall. Rogad plodded forward, and once they were inside, he released the girl, snorted at her, then turned around and exited the chamber, slamming the heavy oak doors behind him. Katy rubbed her wrist as she backed away and found herself standing in a pool of light. When she turned around, Gelzuwin was smiling down on her from atop his dark throne, while all around her things waited in the shadows just beyond her view, strange shapes that were holding still. As her eyes adjusted, she could start to see them. These were woodland creatures, large plumed peacocks, great horned deer, badgers and wolves, all gathered around, quietly blinking at her. Slowly, a little red bushy-tailed fox came forward and took a few steps into the light, then sniffed the air and quickly returned to the shadows. The animals looked on and waited patiently as though Katy were about to say something important. Soon other things began to emerge, creatures that moved among the animals. There were dwarfs and elves, little people that pointed and watched and could hardly sit still, while behind them stood the darker creatures. These were worst of all, and Katy tried not to look at them. There were ogres, goblins, imps and urchins, frightful creatures like lizard monkeys, winged jackals and other nameless things that only lived in nightmares. Most of them tended to stay in the shadows where they belonged, but Katy could hear them grunting and snorting, chattering among themselves, filled with curiosity. Suddenly there was something hurrying out of the shadows, but before Katy could scream, the hideous hook-nosed goblin scampered up, pointed its bony finger at her and laughed. He jeered with great satisfaction, then quickly made his way up the throne steps and perched himself next to the wizard like a vulture. Numlock peered down at Katy and grinned. He was happy to be back in the Nor world and anxious to see what would become of the little girl now that she was without her precious guardian. Another noise echoed from out of the darkness and distracted Katy from the ugly little creature. There were heavy footsteps and the sound of long claws scraping the stone floor. Katy backed away, her eyes growing wider as she watched the huge beast lumbering out of the darkness. "Beware the great brown bear," the chipmunk had said, and the warning echoed in her mind. The animal walked into the light and Katy froze. The bear was truly massive. His head alone was bigger than she was. His legs were the size of tree trunks. His barrel-shaped body was well over 1,000 pounds, and his fur glistened a deep, rich red that shone like auburn. The animal moved slowly as it came forward and looked right at Katy with his golden brown eyes. Katy wanted to faint. She wished she could faint, but she was too scared and unable to move. She feared the monstrous beast would gobble her up in one bite, but to Katy's absolute amazement, the great bear walked right past her. Katy stumbled as she forced her stiff legs to move so she could see where the beast was going. She watched the bear mount the first few steps of the throne, then sit down at the wizard's feet. When Katy had calmed herself, her first thought was that the animal was the wizard's pet, but she began to think otherwise when the great bear sat up, leaned forward, and rubbed its chin as though it were studying her quite carefully. Katy stared back in utter dismay. Then, as if that weren't surprising enough, the enormous beast opened its mouth and spoke.
"A child of God,"
he said in a deep, rumbling voice, and shook his head. There was a gasp from the shadows, as though this was a terrible development. "Calm yourself, my dear Bromwyn. All is well, I assure you," the wizard said, as if to dismiss the animal with a word. The bear growled as he climbed down from the steps of the throne that was once his, then slowly walked around the child to observe her. With his chest out and his head held high, Katy could see he was indeed a king. When the bear was done, he stood in front of Katy and gave a disapproving glance down at her bunny slippers, which were a little ragged, but smiled up at Bromwyn with their usual pleasant grin. Katy looked at the bear in horror. "They're not real, I promise. They're just my slippers," she said, and wiggled her toes to prove it. The bunny slippers nodded as if to say it was true and no harm done. The bear huffed, and Katy breathed a sigh of relief when he turned away to face the wizard. Bromwyn growled loud enough for everyone in the great chamber to hear.
"All is not well, wizard,"
Bromwyn said.
"She is a child of God, a bearer of light. You had no right to bring her here."
Gelzuin peered down from his throne. "Do not forget who is in charge, dear Bromwyn. I will tell you when you are in danger and when you are not," he said. Bromwyn growled.
"How did you do it?"
The wizard only smiled and seemed to enjoy the growing sense of confusion that surrounded the child and her arrival. Bromwyn turned to Katy once more.
"Do you know where you are, child?"
he asked in a voice so deep Katy could feel it grumbling inside of her. "No, sir, but I'd like to go home now, if I may," Katy said. Bromwyn stepped closer and looked her in the eyes.
"This is the Norworld,"
he said.
"The Middle Kingdom beyond the moon and the stars, past the cities of jasper and gold, beyond the earthly realm of slumber, but near to your dreams."
The bear looked on with a curious gaze, and Katy just stared. She had no idea how to respond, or even if she should. The wizard smirked at her charming ignorance, and Bromwyn sighed.
"Indeed you are innocent. The heavenly spheres are beyond your concern, yet here you are. So how did you get here? How did you come to be in our world?"
the bear said, wondering aloud. Katy understood very little except for the last question. "I came through the door." "My door," Katy answered. The bear looked at her questioningly. "I mean, the side of my door," Katy added, trying to be helpful. There was no reaction until she said, "It was a travelling spell." The bear growled once again, and Katy could feel the sound of it go right through her. Bromwyn turned to face Gelzuin and bared his fangs at the wizard.
"More of your evil magic to defy the law. You bridged the gap between worlds and bring God's wrath upon us all,"
Bromwyn said. "What I do is no concern of yours," Gelzuin answered, and sat back, casually admiring one of the larger rings on his fingers. "I will use my magic as I see fit." Bromwyn glared at the wizard.
You have taken my throne and cast your spell of fear over my people, but you do not frighten me, wizard. The fact remains, you have taken a child of God and placed her in harm's way. In doing so, you have angered Almighty God and will surely pay.
The wizard raised an eyebrow and stared at the bear with an intensity that would have made any lesser creature wilt away, but Bromwyn was not done.
Mark my words, wizard. As sure as I stand here before you,
The bear's words ceased abruptly, and the hall fell silent as every living creature pulled back into the shadows. Katy waited for Bromwyn to continue, and when she finally looked to see what was wrong, she gasped. The great brown bear had turned to stone. The statue of the bear was perfect to the finest detail, from the rough stone texture of its fur to its smooth, polished claws that glistened in the dim light. Had it been carved by a master sculptor, it would have been a work of art, but this was a frightful work of magic, and Katy could only stare at the lifeless creature standing before her. Still, for all her fear, there was something hauntingly peaceful about the statue. It was covered in a light frost that sparkled like diamond dust. Katy summoned her courage to reach out and touch the frosted surface, then pulled back and whispered, "What have you done?" The wizard looked down and smiled as he admired his own handiwork. "I like my subjects a little more soft-spoken. Remember that, child. It will serve you well." Suddenly, he paused to glance around the room, then turned to Katy with a look of surprise. "My dear, it seems you have forgotten something." Katy looked around her. "It seems you've misplaced your guardian. I'm afraid that was not very wise. The Nor world is a very dangerous place, especially for a human child. You really should have one, you know. A guardian, that is." The wizard mocked her with a look of concern, then sat back in the shadows and waited. "Don't worry. The challenge will not go unanswered. It's all part of the plan," he said with a fiendish grin. In a distant land known as Paradise, where angels guard the 12 gates of heaven and towering mansions pierce the clouds, the heavenly host was assembled, and the army of God stood ready. Glistening angels gathered together to see who among them would be chosen to rescue the child of God that had been spirited away into darkness. The archangel Michael stood like a general before the assembly. There were seraphim and cherubim, the angel Gabriel, Azrael, the mighty Uriel, and 1,000 gilded warriors ready to heed the call. Then from the heavenly throne came a beam of light that shone down upon a lone warrior, an angel with the heart of a lion. The mighty guardian stepped forward from among the ranks and knelt to receive God's blessing. In an instant, a brilliant ray burst forth from the hallowed halls and shot into the sky above the star-spangled realm. It whistled from one end of the great expanse to the other in the twinkling of an eye. At the leading edge of that brilliant ray was the mighty soldier of God rocketing forward at speeds unimaginable, trailing fire for 100 miles. The angel plunged downward, forging through the clouds like a fiery comet, and looked to the world below. Soon he was skimming the treetops, his eyes like living lanterns searching the land as he approached. Thus God's wrath descended swiftly in the form of an angel, a rod of iron, the measure of truth, the instrument of justice that was known as Stadia. Katy stood next to the stone bear, and the creatures in the dark throne room stared at what remained of their goodly king. They all feared the wizard and his power, and kept their murmurings to themselves, all except one. A light flashed out of the darkness and rose above the crowd. It darted around the bear, then hovered over his head, fluttering on sparkling wings. Katy shied away from the golden light until it held still long enough for her to see, then stared in wonder. The little fairy was barely 2 inches tall and glistened like a star, yet for one so small, her tiny voice caught everyone's attention. Kitch cried out in anger. "You monster! A pox upon your lot! You double-dabbed monster! How could you?" she yelled. Gelzuin turned aside in disgust. "I hate fairies," he said, looking toward the wall. "That is because you have no power over us, you beast. If I could, I'd cast you into the lake of fire myself," she said. Gelzuin's eyes glowed like red-hot coals as he glared at the fairy and growled, "It will take more than you, my dear Kitch, far more than you." The glowing fairy was full of fire, and bold as she could be as she hovered over the stone bear, her tiny wings a blur. Katy gazed at the little creature when suddenly the throne room doors burst open. Before Katy could turn around, Rogad and the other ogre came tumbling in and rolled across the stone floor until they were sprawled out flat on their faces. The two monsters laid there groaning and were either unwilling or unable to stand. Gelzuin and all the dark creatures looked to see what had happened when a loud voice echoed across the hall.
Fear not.
The words rang through the dark chamber as a tall figure of a man strode into the throne room. A long grey cloak flowed around him. It draped all the way to the floor and fully covered his brilliant armour. A gilded helmet of silver and gold was upon his head and had a lustre that glowed brightly. This was the helmet of righteousness, and his was the armour of God. The angel was as big as the one that Katy had left behind. Although his wings remained invisible, the warrior angel was dressed for battle, and as he came forward and removed his helmet, Katy could see his was a face etched by the hand of God. His eyes glistened like sapphires. His hair shimmered like spun gold and flowed about his shoulders. The angel was beautiful and strong. With just one look, Katy was lost in his perfect countenance and knew that he was her defender. The wizard, however, was not so impressed and nestled himself in the comfort of his throne. "Speak of the angel," Gelzuin said in a slow and lazy voice. The angel approached with his helmet tucked under his arm, and as he drew near, a sense of peace rose within Katy that told her who and what he was. When he finally stood before her, Katy tilted her head back till she was looking straight up. "You're an angel, aren't you?" she said.
Indeed I am, child of God,
he answered softly. "I am Stadia."
Are you all right?
Katy loved the warmth of his voice and smiled till her eyes nearly shut. "I am now," she said. "I am now." Suddenly Gelzuin's eyes turned black as coal, and the wizard jumped to his feet upon hearing the angel's name. "What's this?" he yelled, and made the creatures in attendance pull back even further. "Where is the archangel? Where is Michael?" he roared. "This is an outrage. Speak to me, minion. Answer me," Gelzuin demanded. Stadia smiled down on Katy and only gave the wizard a casual glance, then took his time as he turned to face the wizard with a long, slow gaze. "Spare yourself," he said. "Your threats are meaningless. If it were not for Almighty God who has sent me, I would have no need to grace you with an answer. The archangel is about his business. That is all you need to know." Gelzuin shook with rage. His face turned a darker shade of purple. His black eyes bulged. Katy squinted and took a few steps back, afraid that he might actually pop. Then, as quickly as he had been risen to anger, the wizard suddenly became calm again. When he returned to normal, he took a deep breath and forced a smile. "You're trying to bait me, aren't you? Very clever indeed." The wizard looked the angel up and down. "Perhaps I shall have great sport toying with you after all, and when I have done, your lord shall think better next time and send me a real challenge." The angel smiled. "I shall do my best not to disappoint you," he said, then turned his attention to the statue of the bear. "This is your handiwork, is it not? Return the bear now." The fairy Kitch flew near the angel and yelled out, "Yes, yes! Turn him back, you wicked toad!" Gelzuin leaned forward and glared at the fairy, who quickly darted behind the angel and peeked out over his shoulder. "You heard him," she added boldly. The angel locked eyes with the wizard. It was a direct challenge, and all the creatures in attendance watched eagerly to see what would happen next. A few moments later, the wizard simply sat back on his throne and smiled. Of course, as you wish," the wizard said warmly. With a flick of his wrist, the bear was back, and Bromwin's booming voice echoed throughout the chamber as he finished the sentence he had started, just before the spell had been placed upon him.
"I will not allow you to harm this child of God. Do you hear? As long as there is breath within me, I will fight you."
Everyone smiled at the bear, who was completely unaware of what had happened. Bromwin turned to the angel in surprise. and Stadia smiled down on him, saying, "Fear not, dear king, the favour of God is upon you. I have come to help." Bromwyn bowed before the angel, humbled by his presence.
"The Lord is truly merciful. Angel of God, you are most welcomed."
Bromwyn rose and quickly took the opportunity to plead his case against the wizard.
This creature has taken control of my kingdom. With the use of magic, the ogres and his evil horde, he has turned our land into a place of darkness. Though he has promised to leave here once he has found what he is looking for, there is no truth in him. I trust him not."
Suddenly, a little man stepped forward, barely 4 feet tall. His bright red beard and dark brown eyes shimmered in the torchlight as he thrust his fist into the air. "Hear, hear!" yelled Gogarth, leader of the dwarf people. Gogarth was rugged, his skin as tan as leather, his hands as big as oven mitts. The dwarf was dressed in rawhide and wore high boots with a thick leather belt that held a short sword strapped to his side. Others yelled their approval as another dwarf stepped forward, plump as a dumpling with a face as round as a pan. His clothes were made of the finest elk yarn and were neatly tailored. This was Gimble, and Katy liked him the moment she saw him. He nodded at her and doffed his large rakish hat, which had a big white feather tucked in its brim. Other dwarfs rallied behind the angel as well, then more and more, until all of the woodland creatures and the king's loyal subjects were cheering as one. The darker creatures, ogres and goblins alike, sneered and rattled their weapons, and in the midst of the uproar, the wizard finally raised his hands. "Wait! Hear me! Hear me!" he shouted. "The bear has spoken correctly. I have no quarrel with you, dwarfs, elves, woodlanders, any of you. As soon as I have found that which I seek, I swear by the fiery tongue of the Golok, I shall leave this place." Stadia's eyes narrowed as he spoke. "And what is this thing which you seek?" he asked. The wizard paused, and every living creature leaned forward, waiting to hear the answer, and would have gladly given the wizard whatever he wanted to make him go away. "I seek the white horse known as Majesty," the wizard called out in a loud voice for all to hear. At first there was silence, then Katy could hear the name repeated softly, over and over again. Majesty, Majesty, he seeks the white horse. The words spread throughout the chamber until everyone was staring anxiously. Katy was a little shocked herself. She found it peculiar that they all seemed to know about the white horse. After all, that's how she had come to be here. She was chasing what she thought was a white horse, and now it just so happened that this wizard was looking for a white horse as well. Katy suddenly felt a knot in her stomach and suspected the answer to the mystery would not be a pleasant one. The crowd was still murmuring and seething anxiously when there came the tiny sound of laughter. The fairy flew out from behind the angel. The ogres and goblins gave curious glances. Kitch laughed so hard she bobbed like a feather on the air until she came to rest on the great bear's back. The tiny creature rolled around in Bromwyn's fur, kicking her feet and beating her fists, then held her belly, unable to control her laughter. When she finally sat up, she looked at the wizard with a chuckle and a snort, then burst out laughing again. Bromwyn looked back to see the fairy slip off his shoulder with her wings aflutter and plop down onto the floor next to him. Katy couldn't help herself, and smiled as she came closer and stooped down. "What's so funny?" Katy asked, and had to wait a while for the fairy to settle down again. Kitch took a deep breath and finally climbed to her feet exhausted, then looked up into Katy's big brown eyes.
"The wizard is wasting his time," she said. "Everybody knows. No one knows where the white horse is."
Gelzuin smiled cleverly and pointed at Katy. "Then this child, my dear fairy, is that no one of whom you speak, for she knows far more than you think." Kitch stopped smiling. It was an absurd statement. The angel Stadia turned to look at the little girl, then King Bromwyn, then Gogarth and Gimble, and suddenly everyone in the chamber was looking at the little human child. Katy stood there, scratching her leg, and squinted, which is what she did when she didn't know what to do. She had no idea what the wizard was talking about, and could only think of one thing to say. "I want to go home," she whined. The word home echoed throughout the chamber as all the creatures pondered what the wizard had said. It was obvious from Katie's expression that she didn't appear to know anything, but the wizard seemed quite certain of his claim. Stadia stepped forward. "Wizard, I know not what scheme you have laid out before you, but I know this. It will not involve this innocent child. You will deal with me directly." Gelzuin looked down from his throne. "You are of no use to me, angel. My interest is in your master. I seek to defeat the Lord of Glory himself," said the wizard. With that, every creature in the throne room gasped. One dwarf fainted, another screamed, while others stumbled and pushed their way out of the chamber, fearing a lightning bolt would surely burst through the ceiling and strike them all dead.
"Blasphemer!"
King Bromwyn roared. Kitch darted behind the angel again, while others stood trembling. Gelzuin narrowed his eyes, then leant forward and glared. "I will not only defeat the Lord of Glory, but I will use this child to do it, and there is nothing you can do to stop me," he hissed at the angel. Hearing that, Stadia advanced on the wizard and marched up the stone steps when Gelzuin called out, "Careful, angel, lest you jeopardize this innocent child of God." Stadia glared back. "You have no power over her. She is under my protection," he insisted. The wizard smiled. "Ah, yes, but what of her brother? Her dear, non-believing brother? What protection do you offer him?" "What does he mean?" Katie said. "What about my brother?" Gelzuin sighed. "Yes, such a problem. What to do? It appears that your brother's lack of faith has put him out, so to speak, and your mighty angel is powerless to help him. I wonder where the boy is now. I certainly hope he is safe." Gelzuin smiled. Stadia backed away from the wizard, and Katie rushed up beside him. "I don't understand. What does he mean?" she asked, gazing up at the angel. Stadia frowned and looked down as though he were trying to figure out his next move. A moment later, he turned to Katie. "I must go," he said. "No!" Katie cried. "You can't leave me here. Take me with you," she pleaded. Stadia stooped down and put his hand on her shoulder. "I dare not take you away. Our Lord has allowed this to happen for a reason, and when I return we will find the answer together. Till then there is nothing to fear. You will hardly know that I have gone." Katie looked at the wizard and his goblin and all of the horrible creatures that surrounded the throne. The angel continued, "You will be safe as long as you do not speak to the wizard. Say nothing to him. Do not talk to him until I return. Say nothing at all. Is that clear?" Katie felt a little braver and nodded her head. Just then the tiny fairy zipped through the air, quick as a spark, and stood on Katie's shoulder. "Don't worry, I'll be with her the whole time. She won't say a word." Kitch saluted the angel like a proud little soldier. King Bromwyn came alongside to add a word of reassurance.
"We will protect her until your return,"
he said with a deep growl. Stadia stood to his feet, nodded to the bear and the fairy, then looked to the wizard. "If you harm a single hair on her head, I will grind your bones to dust." The wizard bowed politely to acknowledge the threat as the angel left the chamber. As soon as he was gone, Rogad slammed the door shut behind him. The ogre looked at Slag, who was still sprawled on the floor next to him, then rubbed his aching chin and bared his jagged teeth. The little girl had become far more trouble than she was worth. Katie turned to face the wizard, and whatever courage she had quickly left her. Gelzuin smiled down from his throne with the hideous goblin by his side and 100 yellow eyes glaring out of the darkness behind him.
"It's all right, child,"
Bromwyn said, sensing her fear. With that, Katie wrapped her arms around his neck, which was a lot like hugging a bus, and buried her face in his thick fur. The shimmering fairy fluttered just above to offer a little more light, and standing there, lost in a dark world, Katie thanked God for her newfound friends.